Before we begin this remarkable tale of courage and loyalty, tell us in the comments which city you are listening from, so we can get to know our audience and share this incredible story with fellow listeners across the nation. The events you are about to hear unfolded during one of the most brutal winters ever recorded in military history, when American forces pushed deep into enemy territory through landscapes where temperatures plummeted far below freezing and where every step forward meant risking life and limb against an adversary determined to hold every inch of frozen ground. It was January 1945 in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, where the snow fell thick and relentless upon the battlefield, known to the world as the Battle of the Bulge. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell commanded a platoon of 32 men from the 75th Infantry Division, tasked with securing a vital crossroads near the small village of Grandmesnil. His soldiers were exhausted after weeks of continuous combat, their uniforms stiff with ice, their rations nearly depleted, and their morale tested by the screaming rockets and thundering artillery that announced German counterattacks day and night. Communication lines had been severed by shellfire, leaving the platoon isolated in a dense pocket of pine trees where visibility dropped to mere yards and where the crunch of boots on snow could betray a position to hidden enemy patrols. In this frozen hell, survival depended not just on weapons and training, but on instinct, vigilance, and an unshakable bond between brothers in arms who knew that abandoning a comrade meant condemning him to certain death. The men huddled in foxholes carved from frozen earth, their fingers numb despite woolen gloves, watching the tree line for movement that could signal the next assault. 3 days before the incident that would change everything, a yellow Labrador retriever wandered into the American encampment just after dawn, limping slightly on her front left paw and carrying no identification tags or collar that might reveal her origin. The soldiers initially assumed she had escaped from a bombed-out farmhouse or perhaps belonged to a fleeing refugee family, but her calm demeanor and disciplined behavior suggested prior training. Private First Class Daniel Reyes, a farm boy from Kansas who had grown up raising hunting dogs, noticed immediately that the Labrador responded to hand signals and remained silent even when startled. Sergeant Mitchell allowed the dog to stay after she proved useful by alerting the platoon to an enemy scout probe during the second night, her ears swiveling toward distant movement long before human senses detected danger. The men named her Amber for the golden hue of her coat, and she quickly became an unofficial member of the unit, sleeping beside Reyes and following the platoon during daylight patrols through the treacherous snowdrifts. She never barked, obeyed silent commands issued through gestures alone, and possessed an uncanny ability to sense danger before it materialized into direct threat. On the morning of January 17th, Sergeant Mitchell received orders via a lone runner who had survived a harrowing journey through contested territory to deliver sealed instructions that directed the platoon to advance 2 miles northeast and establish an observation post overlooking a suspected German supply route. The mission was critical because intelligence suggested enemy armor would attempt to withdraw through that corridor before Allied reinforcements could cut off the retreat. Mitchell gathered his men in a tight circle beneath the snow-laden branches, their breath forming clouds as he explained the plan, knowing full well that the route ahead crossed open ground where concealment would be minimal. The platoon moved out at 800 hours, advancing in staggered formation through a landscape transformed by war and winter into something alien and hostile. Amber walked beside Reyes near the center of the column, her nose working constantly as she scanned the frozen terrain for scents that might warn of hidden dangers buried beneath the pristine white surface. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels draped in ice, their branches occasionally releasing loads of snow that fell with soft thuds, each sound causing nervous hands to tighten on rifle grips as soldiers struggled to distinguish natural occurrences from enemy activity. Progress was agonizingly slow as the men waded through drifts that sometimes reached their thighs, the physical exertion causing steam to rise from their bodies despite the bitter cold that stung exposed skin and turned exhaled breath into crystalline clouds. Sergeant Mitchell sent 2 scouts ahead to probe for enemy positions while maintaining radio silence to avoid detection by German listening posts equipped with direction-finding equipment capable of pinpointing transmissions. Amber seemed to understand the need for quiet, her paws leaving delicate prints in the snow as she moved with surprising grace through terrain that exhausted the human soldiers. After 90 minutes of hard marching, the scouts signaled a halt using hand gestures that indicated possible enemy presence ahead. The platoon dropped into defensive positions, each man finding what cover existed among the sparse trees and shallow depressions in the ground. Mitchell crawled forward to join the scouts at the crest of a small ridge, where they pointed toward a farmhouse 500 yards distant, its roof partially collapsed and its walls pockmarked by shrapnel. Smoke rose from behind the structure, suggesting recent occupation, and the tactical situation demanded a decision about whether to bypass the location or investigate despite the risks involved. Before Mitchell could issue orders, Amber began to behave strangely, her body going rigid as her attention fixed on a point roughly 50 yards to the left of their current position. Reyes recognized the warning signs immediately, having seen the same posture when she detected the enemy patrol 3 nights earlier. He touched Mitchell's shoulder and pointed at the dog, whose stillness conveyed more urgency than any bark or growl could have achieved. The sergeant understood instantly and signaled for the platoon to freeze in place, while he studied the area where Amber focused her attention. For almost 2 full minutes nothing happened, and some of the younger soldiers began to wonder if the dog had simply spotted a deer or rabbit moving through the underbrush. Then the snow erupted in a violent explosion of white as a camouflaged German soldier rose from a concealed position barely 20 yards from where the American column had been about to pass. The enemy fighter had been lying in wait, covered by a white smock and buried in snow, invisible to human eyes but detectable by Amber's superior senses. Mitchell's rifleman reacted instantly, dropping the German with 3 quick shots before he could raise his weapon or alert other hidden troops. The encounter galvanized the platoon into heightened vigilance, with every man now watching Amber for signs of further danger as they resumed their advance toward the observation post location. Mitchell realized they had walked into the edge of a defensive ambush that could have decimated his unit had the Labrador not detected the concealed enemy soldier. He made a mental note to recommend commendation for the dog if they survived the mission. Though he suspected that official recognition for animal heroism remained unlikely, given the military bureaucracy's focus on human achievements, the column pressed forward with renewed caution, knowing that every step brought them deeper into contested territory. The platoon reached their designated observation point by early afternoon, establishing positions among the ruins of an abandoned stone mill that offered partial protection from the elements and good visibility over the valley below, where the suspected German supply route ran like a pale ribbon through the snow-covered landscape. Mitchell assigned sectors of fire, positioned the radio operator in the most sheltered corner, and sent Reyes with Amber to scout the immediate perimeter for threats that might have been missed during their approach. The building's walls still stood to half their original height, providing windbreak and concealment while allowing fields of fire in multiple directions. The temperature continued to drop as the sun climbed toward its winter zenith, a pale disk that provided light but little warmth to the soldiers who stamped their feet and flexed their fingers to maintain circulation. Mitchell established a watch rotation that would allow men to rest in shifts while maintaining constant observation of the valley and the approaches to their position. The radio operator attempted to establish contact with battalion headquarters, but found that atmospheric conditions or enemy jamming prevented clear transmission, leaving the platoon effectively isolated until the interference cleared or until they completed their mission and withdrew to friendly lines. Amber settled beside Reyes in a corner where fallen roof beams created a small sheltered space, her body heat providing comfort as the two rested during their off-watch period. The dog seemed tired from the morning's exertion, but remained alert, her ears swiveling to track sounds that ranged beyond human hearing. Other soldiers glanced at her with a mixture of respect and affection, understanding that her presence had already saved lives and might do so again before the day ended. One young private from Ohio quietly shared a piece of chocolate from his personal stash, which Amber accepted with gentle dignity before returning her attention to the surrounding environment. As dusk approached, the lookouts reported movement in the valley below, and Mitchell scrambled to the observation point with binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the gathering gloom, he could see a column of German vehicles moving slowly along the road, their headlights covered with slits that reduced illumination to thin beams barely sufficient for navigation. He counted 8 trucks, 3 half-tracks, and what appeared to be a pair of armored cars providing escort, exactly the type of target that artillery had been waiting to engage. The radio operator worked frantically to raise headquarters, adjusting frequencies and antenna positions in desperate attempts to break through the interference. Without warning, Amber leaped to her feet and moved to the northern wall of the ruins, her posture signaling alarm as she stared into the darkening forest beyond their perimeter. Reyes followed immediately, peering into the shadows where snow-laden trees created pools of darkness that could conceal any number of threats. Mitchell joined them within seconds, his carbine raised as he tried to penetrate the gloom with eyes that had not yet adjusted from looking at the brighter valley below. The other soldiers took up defensive positions without needing orders, their movements practiced and efficient, despite the tension that suddenly charged the cold air. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously as German infantry surged from concealed positions in a coordinated assault designed to overrun the American observation post before reinforcements could arrive. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness as both sides opened fire, the sound of rifles and machine guns shattering the frozen silence and sending echoes rolling across the valley. Mitchell realized instantly that they had been spotted during their approach, and that the enemy had waited until nightfall to launch a counterattack meant to eliminate the threat to their withdrawal route. His platoon was outnumbered and surrounded, fighting for survival in the ruins of a mill that had suddenly transformed from shelter into a trap. The firefight intensified as German soldiers pressed their attack from multiple angles, their white winter camouflage making them difficult targets in the darkness, punctuated only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flare that climbed skyward before descending on its parachute to cast hellish illumination across the battlefield. Mitchell shouted orders over the din of combat, directing fire to weak points in the American perimeter and rushing additional ammunition to positions where soldiers burned through magazines at alarming rates. The stone walls of the mill proved their worth as bullets sparked off ancient masonry and ricochets whined into the night air. Amber remained close to Reyes throughout the initial assault, but when a German soldier breached the southern wall and raised his rifle toward the clustered Americans, the Labrador launched herself at the intruder with speed that belied her normally gentle nature. Her jaws clamped onto the soldier's forearm, spoiling his aim and causing his shot to go wide as he struggled to shake off the unexpected animal attack. Reyes finished the engagement with a burst from his rifle, and Amber released her grip immediately, returning to his side without needing a command. The soldier from Ohio who had shared his chocolate stared in amazement, realizing the dog had just saved multiple lives, including his own. The battle raged for 20 brutal minutes before the German forces withdrew, having failed to dislodge the Americans, but having inflicted casualties that reduced Mitchell's effective strength by nearly a third. 5 men lay dead in the ruins, their bodies covered with shelter halves as makeshift shrouds, while 7 others bore wounds ranging from minor shrapnel cuts to serious injuries that would require immediate evacuation if they were to survive. The radio operator had taken a bullet through his shoulder, but continued attempting to establish communication, despite the pain that turned his face pale and slicked his forehead with sweat. The equipment itself had suffered damage from a near-miss grenade, and all attempts to transmit resulted only in static and garbled interference. Mitchell assessed the situation with the grim calculation of a leader who understood that his options had narrowed to desperate choices. They were cut off from friendly forces, surrounded by enemy troops who would almost certainly attack again at dawn, and burdened with wounded men who could not march without assistance. The observation mission had become irrelevant now that their position was compromised, and survival depended on either breaking through enemy lines to reach American positions or holding out until relief forces fought their way through. Neither option offered much hope given their depleted ammunition, lack of medical supplies, and the certainty that German forces would bring heavier weapons for the next assault. As the soldiers reinforced their positions and tended to the wounded using the last of their bandages and sulfur powder, Amber began acting strangely once more. She paced along the northern wall, occasionally pawing at the snow and whining softly in a display of agitation that Reyes had never witnessed before. He followed her to see what had captured her attention, assuming she detected another enemy approach, but instead found her focused on a section of ground where the snow had drifted deep against the mill's foundation. She began digging frantically, her paws throwing snow backward in a spray that revealed darker earth beneath. Reyes called for Mitchell, uncertain whether the dog had simply gone mad from the stress of combat or whether her actions carried significance beyond his understanding. The sergeant arrived with a flashlight, its beam filtered through red cloth to preserve night vision, and directed the light into the hole that Amber continued to enlarge with determined effort. What the light revealed caused both men to catch their breath in surprise. Buried beneath the snow, and hidden for months or perhaps years, lay a German ammunition cache, wooden crates marked with Wehrmacht eagles, and stenciled labels that promised exactly what the surrounded platoon needed most desperately in that moment: grenades, rifle ammunition, and medical supplies. Mitchell immediately ordered soldiers to excavate the cache, while maintaining defensive watches, the men working in shifts to uncover the full extent of supplies that had been hidden by retreating German forces and forgotten or deliberately concealed for future use. The crates yielded stick grenades by the dozen, boxes of 7, 92mm ammunition that would not fit American weapons, but could be booby-trapped or destroyed to deny enemy use, and most critically, a field medical kit containing morphine syrettes, bandages, and surgical instruments that the platoon medic received with hands that trembled from relief rather than cold. The discovery transformed their tactical situation from hopeless to merely desperate. What you're about to hear next represents the kind of decision that tests the bonds between soldiers and the animals who serve alongside them. So tell us in the comments what you would do if your closest companion offered to risk everything to save your life. Mitchell recognized that the supplies, while valuable, did not solve the fundamental problem of being surrounded and cut off from friendly forces. The wounded needed evacuation to field hospitals, and the platoon required reinforcement or extraction before dawn brought renewed enemy attacks. The radio remained non-functional despite the operator's best efforts, leaving no way to call for help or coordinate relief operations. Reyes proposed a desperate plan based on his knowledge of Amber's training and capabilities. Military dogs had been taught to carry messages across battlefields, navigating terrain and enemy lines that would kill human runners, and returning to designated locations through combination of training and instinct. If they could attach a message container to Amber's collar describing their situation and coordinates, and if the dog could somehow find her way through several miles of enemy-occupied forest to reach American lines, then rescue might arrive before the next German assault overwhelmed their position. The plan required trusting that Amber possessed sufficient training to complete such a mission, and that she would survive the journey through a landscape filled with soldiers who might shoot her on sight. Mitchell weighed the options with the cold logic demanded by command responsibility. Sending the dog meant possibly losing their early warning system and condemning the animal to probable death in the frozen wilderness. Keeping her guaranteed nothing except that all of them would die together when the next attack came. He looked at Amber, who sat calmly beside Reyes as if waiting for orders, and saw in her intelligent eyes something that reminded him why the Dogs for Defense program had proven so successful. These animals were not pets, but soldiers who had chosen service as surely as any man who enlisted, and denying them the chance to fulfill their purpose dishonored the bond between species. The platoon medic fashioned a message cylinder from a waterproof artillery shell casing, into which Mitchell placed a handwritten note detailing their position, situation, and urgent need for evacuation of wounded personnel. He included the coordinates of the German vehicle column they had observed, hoping that information might prove valuable, even if rescue arrived too late for his men. Reyes tied the cylinder securely to Amber's collar using parachute cord, then led her to the edge of the perimeter, where the forest opened toward what they believed was the direction of American lines. He knelt in the snow, his hands cupping her face as he gave her a command using the hand signals she understood, pointing toward the distant trees and repeating the gesture that meant go home. Amber licked his face once, a gesture of affection that brought unexpected tears to the eyes of the hardened farm boy, who had trained hunting dogs but never sent one into mortal danger. Then she turned and bounded into the darkness, her golden coat visible for only a few seconds before the night swallowed her completely. The soldiers watched her disappear with mixed emotions of hope and despair, knowing they had just bet everything on the courage and training of a Labrador who had appeared in their lives only 3 days earlier. Mitchell ordered everyone back to defensive positions, and the long wait began, measured in heartbeats and prayers that a dog none of them had known existed a week ago would somehow achieve what seemed impossible. Hours crawled past with agonizing slowness as the temperature dropped to levels that turned breath into ice crystals and transformed exposed metal into flesh-burning cold. The wounded men huddled together for warmth, their groans muted by morphine administered from the German medical supplies that Amber had helped them discover. Mitchell rotated the watch every 30 minutes to prevent frostbite among sentries, who stared into darkness so complete that trees 10 yards distant became invisible shapes distinguished only by slightly darker shadows against the star-filled sky. No one spoke of the dog or the mission she carried through enemy territory, but every soldier thought of little else. The German attack came at 0400 hours, that dead hour before dawn when human alertness reaches its lowest ebb and surprise becomes almost guaranteed. This time the enemy brought mortars that dropped high explosive rounds into the ruins with devastating accuracy, each detonation sending stone fragments and shrapnel screaming through the enclosed space where the Americans fought to survive. Mitchell realized immediately that the Germans intended to pound the position into rubble before launching their infantry assault, a tactic that would minimize their own casualties while ensuring complete destruction of the observation post and everyone in it. The platoon could only huddle in whatever cover existed and pray that direct hits missed the areas where men clustered. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes that felt like hours, transforming the mill ruins into a hellscape of smoke, flying debris and screams from men hit by fragments that tore through flesh with hot metal fury. When the mortars finally ceased, the following silence seemed louder than the explosions had been, broken only by the moans of newly wounded soldiers and the sound of stones still settling from walls that had stood for centuries before being shattered in minutes. Mitchell conducted a quick head count and felt his heart sink as he realized they had lost 4 more men with several others now wounded, reducing his effective fighting strength to barely a dozen soldiers capable of sustained resistance. The German infantry assault followed immediately, with enemy soldiers advancing behind a wall of machine gun fire that chewed the remaining stone walls into powder and forced the Americans to keep their heads down or die. Mitchell knew this would be the final attack, that his platoon lacked the ammunition and manpower to repel another coordinated assault, and that within minutes the position would be overrun. He prepared to give the order to fix bayonets for close combat when one of the lookouts shouted something that cut through the noise of battle and caused every American heart to leap with desperate hope. Amber had returned, but she had not come alone. The Labrador appeared like a golden ghost out of the pre-dawn darkness, but behind her came the most beautiful sight Mitchell had ever witnessed: American soldiers, dozens of them, advancing in combat formation with weapons ready and determination etched on faces streaked with camouflage paint. The relief force had followed the dog through miles of enemy territory, trusting her instinct to lead them to the surrounded platoon, and now they hit the German attackers from behind in a devastating ambush that turned the enemy assault into panicked retreat. Machine guns opened up from unexpected angles, rifles cracked in disciplined volleys, and the superior numbers and firepower of the rescue force decided the engagement within minutes. As the firing died away and German survivors fled into the forest, Amber trotted calmly through the chaos to find Reyes, who dropped to his knees in the snow and wrapped his arms around the dog while tears froze on his cheeks. The relief force commander, a captain from the 2nd Armored Division, approached Mitchell with a grin and explained that his battalion had been preparing a dawn patrol when a Labrador appeared at their forward positions, carrying a message cylinder and refusing to rest until soldiers followed her back into the darkness. The captain had taken a calculated risk, trusting that no German trick would involve a trained American dog, and committed 2 companies to follow the animal through terrain his scouts considered impassable. Now he surveyed the surrounded platoon, the wounded soldiers, and the evidence of desperate fighting with the understanding of a soldier who recognized miracles when they occurred. The evacuation began immediately, as medics from the relief force stabilized the wounded for transport to field hospitals, where surgeons waited to save lives that would have been lost without the timely rescue. Stretcher bearers worked quickly, their movements efficient despite the darkness that still held sway over the forest, and within an hour the first casualties were moving rearward, along routes secured by infantry, who established defensive positions to guard against German counterattacks. Mitchell supervised the withdrawal of his platoon, ensuring that the bodies of fallen soldiers accompanied the living so that no American would be abandoned to frozen ground and unmarked graves far from home. Amber walked beside Reyes during the march back to friendly lines, her earlier energy spent by the marathon journey through enemy territory that had taken her through miles of forest, across frozen streams, and past German patrols that could have killed her with a single shot. The relief force captain recounted how the dog had appeared at their positions around midnight, exhausted but insistent, pawing at soldiers and refusing food or water until they understood she wanted them to follow. A lieutenant who had trained with dogs for defense recognized her behavior as consistent with messenger dog protocols and convinced the captain to take the risk despite regulations that normally prevented night operations through uncleared terrain. The journey to safety took most of the remaining night, with the combined American force moving cautiously through terrain that intelligence reports indicated was lightly held by German rearguard units more interested in retreat than engagement. Dawn found them approaching friendly lines, where challenge and password were exchanged with sentries, who looked surprised to see so many men emerging from the forest that had swallowed Mitchell's platoon 2 days earlier. Hot coffee and food awaited in warming tents, along with staff officers eager to debrief the survivors and learn details about German positions, strength, and intentions that might inform planning for continued offensive operations. Mitchell sat in the command post tent hours later, writing after-action reports that attempted to capture in official military language events that seemed to defy rational explanation. He documented the discovery of the German ammunition cache, the successive enemy attacks, the desperate plan to send Amber for help, and the miraculous rescue that arrived just minutes before his platoon would have been overrun. His written recommendation for commendation included detailed accounts of how the Labrador had detected the camouflaged enemy soldier, fought hand-to-paw against an intruder during the firefight, discovered the hidden supplies, and finally led a rescue force through miles of hostile territory to save 30 lives. He knew the recommendation would likely disappear into bureaucratic files, but honor demanded that he try. Reyes remained with Amber throughout the day, brushing snow from her coat, feeding her from his own rations, and simply sitting beside her while she slept, the exhausted sleep of a soldier who had given everything to the mission. Other survivors from the platoon stopped by to pay their respects to the dog who had saved them, each man contributing something from personal supplies to ensure she ate better than any canine in the European theater. The soldier from Ohio produced another chocolate bar, which Amber accepted with the same gentle dignity she had shown during their first meeting in the ruins. Stories spread through the battalion about the Labrador who had accomplished what seemed impossible, and within days her reputation had reached division headquarters, where staff officers debated whether regulations permitted official recognition of animal heroism. The investigation into Amber's origin revealed that she had indeed served with the 28th Infantry Division before being separated during the initial German assault that began the Battle of the Bulge. Her original handler had been killed in action, and the chaos of retreat had scattered his unit before anyone could recover the trained messenger dog who had wandered lost through combat zones for weeks before finding Mitchell's platoon. Records indicated she had completed over a dozen successful message runs during her service, earning informal recognition from soldiers who understood her value even if regulations prevented formal commendation. The discovery meant that Amber remained property of the United States Army, with assignment to combat duties for the duration of the war. Reyes submitted a formal request to be designated as Amber's new handler, a petition that Mitchell endorsed with written testimony about the bond between soldier and dog that had proven critical to platoon survival. The request worked its way through channels with surprising speed, likely aided by the stories spread through the division and the positive publicity that commanders recognized as valuable for morale during the grinding winter campaign. Within a week, official orders arrived designating Private First Class Daniel Reyes as handler for War Dog Amber, serial number K5117, with authorization to retain her as assigned to the 75th Infantry Division for continued service. The platoon rotated to reserve positions for rest and refitting, a period that allowed soldiers to recover from physical and psychological trauma inflicted by weeks of continuous combat. Amber accompanied Reyes everywhere, her presence a constant reminder of what loyalty and courage could achieve when species barriers dissolved in the crucible of shared danger. The division veterinarian examined her thoroughly, treating minor frostbite on her paw pads and pronouncing her fit for continued service despite the ordeal she had endured. He expressed amazement that she had survived the journey through enemy lines, noting that temperatures that night had dropped low enough to kill a human in hours, and that her thick Labrador coat had barely sufficed to preserve her life. Training resumed for both Amber and the reconstituted platoon, now reinforced with replacement soldiers who arrived from the United States carrying that mixture of eagerness and apprehension common to men who had not yet experienced combat. Mitchell incorporated the new arrivals gradually, pairing them with veterans who could teach lessons that training camps never covered and that only battlefield experience could convey. Amber participated in exercises designed to maintain her skills, responding to commands with the precision that marked a thoroughly trained military working dog whose value had been proven in blood and snow. The war continued its grinding progress toward final victory as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany through the spring of 1945. But Amber's combat service ended when division policy changed to restrict use of dogs in urban warfare, where tactical situations made their specialized skills less applicable. Reyes transferred with her to a rear area training facility, where they assisted in preparing new handler teams for deployment. His combat experience combined with her proven abilities, creating an educational resource that improved survival rates for dogs and soldiers alike. The work felt anticlimactic after the intensity of frontline service, but both adjusted to the rhythm of training cycles and the satisfaction of passing knowledge to others who would face the same dangers they had survived. Victory in Europe came in May 1945, bringing celebrations that swept through military bases and triggered demobilization planning that would return millions of soldiers to civilian life. The Dogs for Defense program began processing trained military dogs for return to original owners or adoption by handlers who had formed bonds during service. Reyes submitted paperwork requesting permission to adopt Amber when his service ended, though regulations remained unclear about whether combat dogs could be released to private ownership or whether they must remain military property for potential future use. The uncertainty haunted him through the summer, as he waited for decisions that would determine whether the dog who had saved his life would spend her remaining years as his companion or disappear into a system that might assign her to another handler or even euthanize her if deemed unsuitable for civilian life. The answer arrived in September 1945 in the form of official orders granting Reyes permission to adopt War Dog Amber upon his honorable discharge from military service. The decision represented a shift in policy as the military recognized that combat dogs, who had formed strong handler bonds, adjusted better to civilian life when allowed to remain with the soldiers they had served beside. Reyes accepted his discharge papers and train tickets home to Kansas in October, with Amber sitting beside him, wearing a new collar that held no message cylinder, but instead carried tags identifying her as a retired military working dog who had earned her rest through service to the nation. The train journey across America gave Reyes time to plan the future he would build in a country no longer at war, a future that included the golden Labrador who slept on the seat beside him while farmland and small towns rolled past the window. He thought about the farm he would return to, the family who waited with letters that spoke of relief and joy at his survival, and the quieter life that awaited after years of violence and fear. Amber would adjust to hunting pheasants instead of detecting enemies, to sleeping in a barn instead of frozen foxholes, and to a world where loud noises meant tractors rather than artillery. He wondered if she would remember the snow and the blood, or if dogs possessed the mercy of forgetting what humans could never escape. Kansas welcomed them home in autumn colors, the wheat fields golden under skies so vast and peaceful that Reyes felt dizzy with the space and silence after months of forest combat, where horizons measured in yards and quiet meant danger. His family embraced him on the platform with tears and questions, their eyes finding the dog at his side and understanding without explanation that this animal represented something profound and unbreakable. His younger brother, too young for military service but old enough to understand sacrifice, knelt to greet Amber with gentle hands and received her approval in the form of a tail wag that seemed to signal acceptance of this new pack. Amber adapted to farm life with the same competence she had displayed in military service, learning the routines of feeding livestock, patrolling fields for predators, and accompanying Reyes during hunting season when pheasants exploded from cover in a burst of wings that echoed gunfire but carried no deadly intent. The nightmares came less frequently as months passed, though both man and dog would sometimes wake in darkness, with racing hearts and defensive instincts, triggered by sounds that proved harmless upon investigation. The family learned to move quietly around them, and to understand that certain noises or situations might provoke reactions disproportionate to actual threat, legacies of combat that time would ease, but never entirely erase. The local newspaper heard about Amber's service and requested an interview that Reyes reluctantly granted, uncomfortable with attention, but understanding that stories of courage deserved telling. The article appeared on the front page with a photograph of soldier and dog standing in front of the family barn, and the publication triggered responses from across the region as veterans wrote letters describing their own experiences with military dogs, and as civilians expressed gratitude for sacrifices made by men and animals alike. Several of those letters came from members of Mitchell's platoon who had scattered to home states after discharge, their words confirming that Amber remained a legend among survivors who credited her with their lives. Years passed with the gentle rhythm of agricultural seasons, wheat planting and harvest marking time, in ways that combat veterans found healing after the chaos of war. Reyes married a schoolteacher from the neighboring county, built a house on family land, and started a family that grew to include 3 children who learned gentleness and courage from a golden dog who tolerated their play with patience that seemed infinite. Amber aged gracefully, her muzzle going white and her movements slowing, but her eyes retained the intelligence that had saved lives in Belgian forests during a winter that seemed increasingly distant as peace stretched into decades. The letter arrived in 1954, nearly 9 years after the war's end, bearing official military letterhead and formal language that explained how the Department of Defense had established a program to recognize animal heroism through formal commendations previously reserved for human soldiers. Sergeant Mitchell, now a civilian contractor but still maintaining contact with veterans of the 75th Infantry Division, had revived his original recommendation and submitted additional testimony from platoon survivors whose statements documented Amber's actions with precision that bureaucrats could not ignore. The medal arrived weeks later, a bronze disc bearing the image of a dog and inscribed with words that honored courage, loyalty, and service above and beyond the call of duty. Reyes organized a small ceremony in the barn where Amber spent most of her days, inviting family and a handful of surviving platoon members who traveled to Kansas to witness the recognition they had advocated for years. Mitchell made the journey from Pennsylvania, his civilian suit unable to entirely hide the military bearing that combat command had etched into his posture and movements. The soldier from Ohio arrived with his wife and children, carrying the chocolate that had become his traditional gift to the dog who had saved him. Others came from Missouri, Illinois, and Texas, their reunions marked by embraces and tears, and the unspoken understanding shared by men who had faced death together. The medal was attached to a new collar that Amber wore with the same dignity she had shown throughout her service, and photographs captured the moment for local newspapers that ran stories about the decorated war dog living quietly on a Kansas farm. The children asked questions about the war that the veterans answered carefully, editing out the horror while preserving the truth about sacrifice and brotherhood and the bonds that transcended species in moments of ultimate crisis. Amber sat calmly through the attention, her tail wagging occasionally, perhaps understanding that the fuss honored something important, or perhaps simply enjoying the presence of familiar scents and voices from a past she had never entirely left behind. Mitchell spoke briefly about the night when desperate men had trusted their lives to a Labrador's courage and training, his voice breaking when he described watching her disappear into darkness, carrying their only hope of survival. He thanked her formally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. Because how do you thank someone for giving you tomorrow when yesterday should have been your last day? The other veterans added their testimonies, each man recounting details about what Amber had meant during those frozen hours when existence narrowed to the next heartbeat and the next breath, and the question of whether rescue would arrive before death. The ceremony concluded with a meal that brought together families who had never met, but shared connections forged in circumstances they hoped their children would never experience. The veterans fell into comfortable patterns, their conversations mixing updates about civilian lives with carefully edited memories of military service that emphasized courage over carnage and humor over horror. Amber moved among them, accepting attention with grace, and when darkness fell, she settled beside Reyes with the contentment of a soldier who had completed her mission and earned her rest. She passed away peacefully in the spring of 1956, 11 years after the war that had defined her service and shaped her legend. Reyes buried her on a hill overlooking the wheat fields, beneath a stone marker that recorded her name, her service dates, and a simple inscription that read, "She saved us all." The funeral drew dozens of people, including veterans who traveled long distances to pay respects to a dog who represented something larger than individual heroism, something about loyalty and sacrifice, and the recognition that courage wears many forms, including golden fur and 4 legs. The story of Amber lived on through the decades, as historians documented the Dogs for Defense program and the thousands of animals who served during the Second World War. Books and documentaries included her among the most decorated and celebrated military dogs, and her actions during the Battle of the Bulge became teaching examples at military training facilities, where handlers learned that the bond between soldier and dog could mean the difference between life and death. Reyes lived to see his grandchildren, passing on stories about a Labrador who dragged hope from frozen snow and led salvation through enemy darkness, ensuring that her memory would survive beyond the lifetimes of the men whose lives she saved. The medal remained in the family, displayed with Reyes's own decorations, a bronze testament to the truth that heroes come in all forms and that the greatest acts of courage often come from the most unexpected sources, when the need is greatest and the stakes could not be higher.